or came up with a novel idea called genocide. And then because that was even or we were applying it to a diaspora of people, it was even abstracted down further still to the idea of crimes against humanity. And all of a sudden, you could not, you could charge God with crimes against humanity, but you could not charge humanity with crimes against God.
Hey, what's going on? Welcome to Unlatched Minds, episode 56. Today, my guest is Dr. Timothy Shaw. Dr. Shaw is a philosopher, public intellectual. Dr. Shaw has a PhD in moral injury. So, and that's the topic of the discussion today: moral injury. I had been reading some content out there from Dr. Shaw, and I honestly had no idea what moral injury was. But really interesting topic. It's basically a reaction to some traumatic event that sort of crushes someone's morals or values, right? Their values or morals are just violated, right? Think about the victims of the Holocaust, right? You could imagine. I mean, we can barely imagine, but you can see how someone's entire belief system could be shattered after going through something like that, right? Where is God, right? What? How could this happen to me? Their entire value structure can be shaken to the core, and it's super interesting because it's part biology, part psychology, part sociology, and part spiritual. So real complex sort of way of looking at particular types of trauma. So anyway, so let's just jump in. Dr. Timothy Shaw. So Dr. Timothy Shaw, thank you so much for joining me, man. I appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure.
It's 2:40 here on the East Coast of the States, and what time you say? You're in Sydney. What time you got? 6:30 a.m.
6 in the morning.
Yeah, there you go. So we're going to talk about moral injury. Full disclosure, I had no idea what the hell it meant when I first heard the term, but I started digging into it, and gosh, it's fascinating. It really is. And I've heard a couple of at least one podcast you have done in the past. I've read some of your material, and it's funny. It's a phrase that it's two words that really sum up a really complex thing. We'll get into the details, but I guess before we get started, just a little quick background on yourself, and maybe how you came to this interest in moral injury.
I started an interest in moral injury through some research that I did in the just war tradition, and looking at the causes or how we fight, or what wars we fight for, and how we fight in them, and how that is reflected in the societies in which we come from and the values of those societies. Moving to the next research, I found that while it could identify some very poignant, trolley cart problems, it's a terrible situation and there's no win situation. I found that it was lacking some of the ideas that our modernity is based upon, which have emerged from World War II and the Holocaust. And the ideas of meaning or meaninglessness of suffering and religion that has been spawned from World War II and has been recognised by the Catholic Church with their move to Vatican II and more recently their total condemnation of capital punishment, and in society through a lot less religiosity being shown and displayed. And then I moved. I thought, Jesus Christ, if you can say that, where to from here? And I was reading a philosopher called Frederik Nietzsche, and I thought, you know what, if I'm going to talk about moral injury, I'd better really know what Frederik Nietzsche is talking about when he writes about the genealogy of morals, and understood as one of the forefathers of psychoanalysis. and a real predictor of the emerging and emergent conditions that our society has. And I started listening and reading what other people had written about him, and I thought, whoa, this is a bird's nest, right?
Yeah.
And what I did surmise was that his most important work for himself was a book called Thus Spake Zarathustra. And when I started to dig into what this book meant, it was even more confusing, which led me to start a very long investigation into what the book is. And really what it is, it's a discussion of how he went from the birth of tragedy after he came back from war to the joyous wisdom. And it is talking about that transformation in his psyche, which came post his wartime experiences. Because, of course, Nietzsche is a veteran, and through that work, I was able to understand and develop a definition for moral injury, which comes from the third book of his most important philosophical or political treatise, which is The Genealogy of Morals, and particularly the third book. And it's the penultimate aphorism. Aphorism 27 is where the definition arises. And honing in to really start to describe how this moral injury, in conjunction with, Nietzsche was writing before the Holocaust, and his works have been misrepresented quite terribly. But show how these ideas start to fit in and make sense with his tractus of work.
So you probably did this by with your little intro, but maybe a little more layman's sort of description. What is moral injury?
Sure. So I think it's to really understand what exactly moral injury is. It's important to understand that, or understand why or when, particularly when, it has emerged into a lexicon for a social lexicon. So there are, everyone will say, well, there's always been moral injury, right? But we have found it necessary in the 21st century of Christian or Christendom thought to introduce a term called moral injury. Now, the timing or what moral injury means is wrapped up in this 20 centuries of stony sleep or understandings of what now slouches towards Bethlehem, if you will. It's the poem by Yeats, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, is the most, the Second Coming, is the most pillaged piece of prose in the whole of the English canon. It's the most evocative metaphor that we have, according to the Paris Review. And I thought to myself, well, why has it emerged at this moment? What is it? You've got the church that has one understanding that they're still trying to develop and trying to get a one voice about really what it is. And there's a lot of people doing some very good work in there. Reverend Dr. Powers, he's just established the International Centre for Moral Injury. He's doing fabulous work in the field. Then we have a definition that really launched the concept, which came about by an independent scholar, psychoanalyst called Jonathan Shea, who understood the term as being let down by a position of authority, quite culturally construed. And then moving to clinetics, we have Brett Litzt and his colleagues that really tried to sharpen the understandings of moral injury as a perpetrative understanding of actions that you either omit or commit, and understanding really how these ideas have emerged, because they've emerged after this idea called post-traumatic stress disorder, which with the stroke of a pen changed trauma from an unnatural or an abnormal event to a normal event from an abnormal stressor. So instead of trauma being an abnormal event from an abnormal stressor, it's a normal event from an abnormal stressor. Right. Well, how do we understand, is it normal to feel bad about certain acts of war or wartime? How do we think about them in moral terms? What's the impact of the church, of Christian doctrine and society? And it's all jumbled up. And it was Frederik Nietzsche that said, it is such a devilishly difficult problem. He dedicated his whole corpus of work is dedicated to the extrapolation of moral injury and also trying to cure it, or having a curative basis, which he sees as a psychology of which he calls, a Superman psychology, or some way in which these ideas are thought of in a different manner. And these are the ideas which, because Nietzsche was a veteran and because he's been misunderstood for all these 140 years, and because the scholarship on his work really does not take into account these most profound framing aspects, the real corpus, or the people that really should have Nietzsche's work, are veterans, are soldiers, are people that have come back from war, are people that have had to articulate their obligations to other people and have really had to really think about this more than the person walking down the street. And that's when Nietzsche sees this idea of a new nobility, or some form of he said in the time of of a classless or no basis for value. He said this is where he would like to insert some basis of value in a time where knowledge becomes weaponized through the mass articulation of it, and whereby meaning, or the framing of what knowledge means, is a mere shadow or byproduct in the regurgitation of things that suit an agenda, political, personal, what have you.
Yeah, you mentioned PTSD there. One of the questions I had is, what's the relation there? What's the different? What are the similarities, or I guess compare and contrast what moral injury is, as opposed to PTSD?
Sure. Post-traumatic stress disorder, it came into existence really from two different fields, or two different concerns. In America at the time, there were soldiers coming back from war. It was the Vietnam War. And also there was a call for abuse in societies, or the abuse of young people, and the harm that causes, because going back, if you go back into Christian societies, and this is something that is an inescapable reality. If you had a problem, or if, for example, if you, as someone that had no power, were abused or what have you, and if you went to a priest, depending on what was everyone wants meaning for their suffering, right? So why are you suffering? Why did this happen to me, right? And at its very depth, it's inescapable in Christianity. At its very depth, the meaning is because you are in a God or Jesus or an ideal is here, and your relation to divinity is stopped short of perfect, and you must always be better. And in the end, you're originally sinful, and this is your own fault. And this is what Nietzsche draws attention to. He says this ideal of finding meaning from our own find our search for meaning. It's not so much suffering that we despise; it's suffering where there's no meaning attached to it. And for 2,000 years, Christianity has provided meaning for that suffering through through that relationship, which Nietzsche draws attention to. So the birth of PTSD was victims crying out for recognition for trauma, and before then, these traumas were understood as abnormal reactions to abnormal stresses, and after they were normalized to normal reactions to abnormal stresses, society had finally a lexicon to be able to talk about trauma, to speak and to understand victim testimony and the like. However, of course, the outcome of PTSD was that regardless, however, this is one of the unforeseen but unavoidable outcomes, is that if you broke your leg, regardless of whether you broke your leg kicking someone or being kicked by someone, that was seen as a normal reaction to an abnormal stressor, and that person was then in some way a victim. So it's very difficult to assign victimhood to someone that broke their leg kicking someone, right? Or it's possibly hard to assign victimhood, not that in the common sense, for someone that feels bad for shooting someone, right? You can say that you're a victim, but someone's dead, right? And then moral injury has emerged to sort of fill that gap.
Yeah, the thing that struck me is I was following some of your content on now. What is your website called?
Great Philosophical Problems.
Yeah. And there's a bunch of, you had some really good content there. And I was, in my head, I sort of drew, a couple little, I'm very visual. I drew a couple little circles. Like there's like a medical component to this. There's like a philosophical component and a spiritual. And I read, then I did a little digging, I went to ptsd.gov and they call it a bio, I thought this was perfect, right? Socio-spiritual model that they say has been recommended as a framework to sort of understand this. And I thought, wow, first of all, would you agree with that they kind of articulate these 4 tenets: biology, and I would say that's medical, right? Psychology, sociology, and spiritual. And man, all of those things to quantify those 4 independent things, to understand them and to apply them to any person going through something or experiencing it. I don't know how I was going to ask you about treatment a little bit later, but maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit. But my gosh, just to understand, the biology part, I think, is probably the most straightforward, because we can actually there's you can measure that and you can treat that sort of. The rest of it,
you can measure changes in the brain. It's very difficult. There is the brain is more complex than it's the most complex. The brain is as complex as the whole universe, right? It understands things in multi-dimensional structures, and while we might see a bit of a brain lit up at some moments, I would suggest that putting all your weight or understandings into such an explicit a basic explanation is useless. Really, PTSD, or understanding the emergence of post-traumatic stress disorder, it's really all coming from under the umbrella of the Christian culture that has moved from waiting for the second coming of Christ to looking for that first lightning of ego death. And a lot of and once that is really re-articulated, and societies break away from faith and belief and morph into scientific understandings of the world, no longer were traumatic events that used to be dealt with by the church, no longer are those able to be sufficiently dealt with, and nor do the societies are arranged around those institutions or ways of dealing with it anymore. And so any any definition of what PTSD is, or even, and particularly what moral injury is, it has to really zoom back out and say, well, hang on a second. When did these ideas become important for our societies? At what point are our societies in relation to our faith, understandings of religiosity? But I don't believe that the definitions of PTSD, or particularly for moral injury, but also for PTSD, I don't believe that they constitute a holistic definition that really takes into account some such deeply rooted understandings that they're very difficult to talk around, to even really acknowledge. For example, everyone believes that they're very, very deep psychological understandings, which are very difficult to enunciate or draw attention to, particularly when there are very, very powerful interest groups involved.
One thing I didn't predict is how many times you would reference Christianity in this discussion. So that obviously I probably missed that as a key sort of input to the definition of moral injury. I guess
it's central.
Interesting. Now, Christianity specifically, not just spirituality or religion.
Well, if you think about what spirituality or religion, for first world Christian societies, they have really put a wedge, or that they are enlightened, and that enlightenment means they have basically drawn out the characteristics of heaven and codified them into law, and they are using justice, not faith, to really guide principles. Where if you look back at maybe other societies that are connected with God, there is less that faith and justice are really intermingled, and you see this with the emergence actually of Superman just before World War II. In Christian societies, and there is like a very interesting thing that's happening, because while we have less religiosity or more atheistic ideas, those atheistic ideas are profoundly based upon Christian morals and Christian judgments. When these, so for example, when you have societies that are moving towards these ideas, it might appear that these ideas have become not relevant anymore. However, the movement of Christianity, or first, there is a looking towards Eastern religions, to Buddhistic teachings, to holistic ideas of wholeness. The searching, or the looking for these sort of non-confrontational. I mean, we all believe that we are almost like Buddha. We all have the power of, back then he was a prince. He had a lot of power, a lot of privilege. We have just as much privilege in first world Western democracies, freedom of speech, all these ideas. Just like Buddha, we think we are going to go in and sit under a tree, and it's all going to, collapse into itself, and we will find some harmony in these in these ideas which do not, they can never congeal completely. And once we have got a form that puts our mind or psyche at rest, then we might go down, roll up our yoga mat, and go and have a nice cup of coffee, latte, and talk about how great we are and how good we feel, and then we'll look at the television. We'll see another famine, and we'll say, God, isn't the world a terrible place? But aren't we great people? And these are some of the ideas which are very fundamentally difficult to approach, because you're really saying to people, well, hang on a second. Everyone thinks that they want to help, right? And this was the understanding that Nietzsche arrived at the end of his towards the joyous wisdom after he started at the birth of tragedy, and he goes, I will not be silent about my morality that says you may wish to help, but you only really wish to help those people whose suffering that you totally understand, really just your friends, and only in the way in which you would help yourself. And that's it, right? And that is it for most people, right? However, to get to that understanding, or to really understand what that understanding means, it takes, there is a process which he's sort of outlining through his ideas on moral injury and the implications of what that actually means for a society which is so blinkered into these ideas.
Again, with the spiritual side of things, I won't say Christianity. I'll just keep it more generic, spiritual, just because I think the question applies to anything from the spiritual realm. It's like. You mentioned I think in a lot of the talks you have done, you mentioned the Holocaust and things like that. Obviously, that was a huge, that was a historical, an immense part of all of our history. Whether we went through it, know somebody went through it, or just know it through the lens of history, right? It affected us all. It still does, right? We're still talking about it as we should.
Changed how we thought about memory, how we thought about the past.
Yeah, but if somebody was, I guess, and this question may or may not make sense, or may help the discussion, may not. But if someone was, say, a Christian, or a very spiritual person, put it that way, just keep it generic, and they went through the Holocaust, would it you have two people, super spiritual person A, person B is not spiritual at all, very, very hedonistic, just looks through the lens of just very atheistic. We're all just a bunch of atoms with absolutely no meaning. Which one of those two people would be less morally injured? Say they both survived physically out of the out of that atrocity.
It's a great question.
Okay.
That's a great question. I think it's when we look at the Holocaust, the meaning that has come from it always takes some time to articulate or how to talk about these events, because as soon as you start talking about the event, you totalize it. It becomes you're sort of taking away from that event. However, there is a philosopher called Emmanuel Levinas, and he was in the concentration camps. He had his whole family, I think apart from his wife, murdered by the Nazis, and he was captured, and he, long story, but he ended up writing a work called Useless Suffering. And he said, how do we understand, or how should we start understanding suffering for ourselves as someone that has profoundly suffered? How do we understand, for example, because his idea of understanding what you should do, or what's important to do, he said, well, hang on a second, we don't use empathy. Take empathy off the table, because as soon as you put yourself in someone else's shoes, you can say, well, you know what, I agree with that suffering, I'm going to help it, but all of a sudden you say, well, hang on a second, I don't agree with that, or I'm going to excuse the suffering of someone else. And he said, hang on a second, let's start and have a phenomenology of understanding. So without even asking for help, instead of the crying out for help, it's the non-vocal, the guttural sort of noises of someone that can't even talk, extreme suffering of someone else, for whom that suffering that someone else is doing is not providing meaning to their existence, because that is actually the draining, or the ontological draining of meaning from their understanding of being, and that your recognition of that, and your understanding and acknowledgement of that, provides meaning to someone else's suffering. And that's how he got around this idea of meaning, the meaning of suffering, because the Jewish people had a big problem from the Holocaust, because they could not explain the sins, or they could not explain the horrific things that had happened to the Jewish people from the sins of ancestral sin. And it was Levinas that said, hang on a second, we need to pull God out of the sky, out of the heavens, and we need to implant him in the human, right? Right in the human. And this is quite similar, obviously, to Nietzsche, that said, God's dead, right? There's no person in the sky. And these are philosophers, and and sorry for speaking so directly about it, but these are just schools of thought.
Yeah.
And I apologise if it's confronting. And Levinas, what he ended up doing is saying, well, hang on a second, by putting God into other people, we have also moved from this idea of, the Judeo-Christian God, which, started off in the heavens with Judaism or spirit, and then that spirit moved into man through the understandings of Jesus, right? Because Jesus, a Hebrew-speaking enlightened Jew, Alpha, Omega, same God, Moses' laws, I agree with them, right? He understood himself as sort of Jewish, right? And then the next metamorphosis of that, right, is to the populace. So the spirit goes from the heavens to man to the populace, and once it reaches the populace, right, it's another ball game, and the understandings that came from Nuremberg, which was the site in which the condemnation of the most vile criminals that the earth had ever seen had to be done not through crimes against God. They weren't charged against crimes against God or anything. They invented or came up with a novel idea called genocide, and then because that was even we were applying it to a diaspora of people, it was even abstracted down further still to the idea of crimes against humanity. And all of a sudden, you could not. You could charge God with crimes against humanity, but you could not charge humanity with crimes against God. So if you had the Hebrew God walking down the street saying, those people in the next suburb, they're bad people. You know what? Maybe we'll build out our suburb further out onto their suburb, or maybe we will kill every third born, whatever, right? Right. Those arguments were accepted, right? That was not a problem, right? For many thousands of years. But all of a sudden, these laws that they're bad people because they don't believe in our God or this or that, right? No longer can you infringe upon the base structure of a human, right? Where God actually resides, and he doesn't any longer reside in that belief or in any belief, right? So you can't use someone's belief or the concept of sin, original sin, or someone deserves it. No, that's all out the window, and in comes the idea of humanity and crimes against it, which you can charge. So, for example, this is how profound these ideas are, that they are being retrospectively applied to events and understandings that occurred before the inception of these laws. So, Turkey's not too pleased about the understandings that are surrounding the Armenian genocide. And what we see here is that these understandings are, how we understand things in the present is now colouring back through all these ideas from the past. And there's a danger once you recolour things with genocide-coloured glasses, or that you start to overlook things that also need to be coloured in, but which you're unwilling to sort of turn the page and start to look at really what that image really is consisting of, particularly when that image is a psychological or a psychological portrait of yourself.
It seems very complicated to approach helping someone going through this. What's the latest out there that's showing some promise, if anything?
I've taken a very good course that's presented through some ideas of Jonathan Shea and by Volunteers America, that's led by Rita Brock. It's a fabulous understanding, and the course materials are very informative. There is a lot of I won't go into it, the course, because it's not mine. Where the think tank that I'm involved with my research assistant based in the US, Ansley, we're compiling some materials to sort of start explaining and remediating the idea of moral injury. There is a whole host of it's quite particular, I guess. It's very particular, and it depends at what depth moral injury is wanting to be explored, and it must be sensitive to the belief structures of every individual person. And have something that, but at first and foremost, right, does no harm.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Shaw, thank you for your time. I will be in touch when this publishes, and we'll go from there. But thank you. I'm glad we got this in. I appreciate it.
No, it's a real pleasure.
Enjoy the rest of your day. I know it's early out there, so I appreciate you
Thank you,
jumping on.
A real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you.